On the morning of September 14, 1977, James Warren pulled his postal truck to the curb at 2847 Maple Avenue in Falls Church, Virginia, and noticed something unusual about one of the envelopes in his delivery bundle. The envelope was a thick manila, approximately 9 by 12 inches, with a typed address label centered precisely on the front. The postage had been applied using a commercial meter, postmarked from Chicago 3 days earlier, and there was no return address anywhere on the exterior. James held the envelope for a moment longer than necessary, turning it over in his hands, looking for any indication of origin beyond the postmark, but finding nothing. He placed it in the mailbox at 2847 Maple Avenue, closed the metal door, and continued down the street. James Warren was 34 years old and had been a postal carrier for 8 years, the last 5 of them on Route 447, which covered a residential section of Falls Church that sat approximately 20 minutes from Langley and was populated primarily by government workers, defense contractors, and military personnel stationed at nearby installations. He knew the route the way a person knows the rooms of their own house, could tell you which families were expecting packages, which residents traveled frequently for work, and which mailboxes required extra force to close properly because the hinges had rusted over time. He took pride in this knowledge, in the reliability of his service, and in the fact that after 5 years, most of the people on his route knew him by name. The recipient at 2847 Maple Avenue was Robert Chen, a man in his late 30s who worked from home as a freelance translator according to a conversation James had once had with him while delivering a certified package that required a signature. Chen was polite but reserved, the kind of person who answered questions with just enough detail to be courteous but never offered additional information voluntarily. He lived alone as far as James could tell, kept his lawn mowed, and generally maintained the kind of low profile that made him forgettable in a neighborhood where most residents were similarly occupied with their own professional lives and had little time for socializing. 3 weeks later, on October 3rd, another envelope arrived for Robert Chen with the same characteristics. Typed address label, commercial metered postage, no return address. This time, the postmark was from Detroit. James noticed it immediately, felt the same mild curiosity he'd felt with the first envelope, and delivered it without incident. When a third envelope arrived on October 29th, postmarked from Boston and bearing the same typed label and absence of return address, James began to pay closer attention. A fourth envelope arrived November 18th from Philadelphia, and by then James had started to recognize a pattern. The letters always arrived on Wednesdays or Thursdays, always bore postmarks from major cities, always had typed address labels, and never included return addresses. James began carrying a small notebook in his postal bag, the kind with a spiral binding and blue lines that he'd originally purchased to track mileage for tax purposes but had never used. He started noting the dates and postmark cities of Chen's unusual mail deliveries, writing in shorthand that only he would understand. October 3rd, Detroit. October 29th, Boston. November the 18th, Philadelphia. December 8th, Atlanta. By late December, he had documented 7 letters over a span of 14 weeks, and what had begun as mild curiosity had transformed into something more deliberate. A quiet investigation conducted entirely in his own mind as he moved through his daily route. What struck James most was not just the pattern of the letters themselves, but Robert Chen's behavior upon their arrival. Chen seemed to be watching for the mail truck. On multiple occasions, James had seen the curtain in the front window move as he approached, and Chen would emerge from the house within 90 seconds of delivery, sometimes less, to retrieve his mail. For most residents, mail retrieval was a casual afternoon task, something done when convenient. For Chen, it appeared to be something monitored and immediate, at least on the days when these particular envelopes arrived. James found himself thinking about the letters during his off hours, turning the pattern over in his mind while having dinner with his wife Linda or watching television in the evenings. One night in mid-December, he asked her a hypothetical question, keeping the details vague enough that he wasn't violating any Postal Service confidentiality protocols. "What would you do?" he asked, "if you saw something at work that seemed wrong but wasn't technically illegal?" Linda had looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup and asked what he meant by wrong, and James had struggled to articulate it. Not wrong exactly, he'd said, but deliberate in a way that felt purposeful, like someone was trying very hard to avoid creating a record. Linda had suggested that if it bothered him that much, he should probably mention it to someone, but James wasn't sure who that someone would be or whether his observations would be taken seriously. On December 22nd, another envelope arrived for Robert Chen, thicker than the previous deliveries, postmarked from New York. James delivered it at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, and Chen retrieved it from the mailbox within 2 minutes, so quickly that James was still visible down the street when Chen stepped outside. James sat in his postal truck for 5 minutes after completing that block's deliveries, engine idling, staring at the notebook on the seat beside him where he'd documented 12 letters over 16 weeks. The accumulated weight of the pattern had become impossible to ignore, and the question was no longer whether something unusual was happening at 2847 Maple Avenue, but what James was supposed to do about it. On January 8, 1978, James Warren walked into the postal inspector's office in Arlington and asked to speak with someone about a delivery pattern he'd been observing on his route. The receptionist directed him to Inspector Theodore Walsh, a man in his mid-50s with gray hair and the kind of measured expression that suggested he'd heard every possible complaint and concern a postal carrier could bring to his attention. James sat across from Walsh's desk and they opened his notebook, presenting 16 weeks of documented observations about Robert Chen's mail. Walsh listened without interrupting, occasionally glancing at the notebook entries, and when James finished his explanation, Walsh leaned back in his chair and said that while the pattern was certainly interesting, there was nothing illegal about receiving mail without return addresses. People had privacy rights, and the Postal Service existed to deliver mail, not to investigate the personal correspondence of American citizens. James had expected this response, but he pressed the point anyway, explaining that the letters always came from major cities, always on specific days of the week, always with the same typed labels and metered postage. Walsh studied James for a moment, then asked why a postal carrier would spend 4 months documenting something like this unless he believed it meant something significant. James said he didn't know what it meant, only that it felt deliberate, orchestrated, like someone had designed a system specifically to avoid creating patterns that anyone would notice. Walsh closed the notebook and handed it back to James, but then said that given the proximity of Falls Church to Langley and other sensitive government installations, he would forward James's information to the FBI liaison office, not because he thought anything would come of it, but because it was protocol when postal employees raised concerns about possible security matters. 7 days later, on January 15th, James received a phone call at home from a woman who identified herself as Special Agent Karen Mitchell from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. She asked if James would be willing to meet with her to discuss his observations about deliveries to 2847 Maple Avenue, and James agreed immediately, surprised that anyone was taking his concerns seriously. They met the following afternoon at a coffee shop in McLean, and Mitchell arrived carrying a thin folder and wearing an expression that suggested she already knew more about Robert Chen than James did. She asked James to walk through everything he'd noticed, and as he spoke she took notes in a shorthand that was far more efficient than his own. When James finished, Mitchell set down her pen and explained that what he'd been observing was consistent with what the FBI called an accommodation address, a technique used by foreign intelligence services to receive communications without routing them directly to diplomatic facilities or known operatives. She said that sympathizers or recruited assets would receive mail on behalf of intelligence officers, creating a buffer that made it difficult to trace the ultimate recipient of the information. The letters James had been delivering, Mitchell explained, might contain coded instructions, operational details, or intelligence reports disguised as innocent correspondence. She asked if James would be willing to continue documenting Chen's mail and to report immediately if anything unusual occurred beyond the established pattern. James agreed without hesitation, though he felt a strange mixture of validation and unease. For the next 2 weeks, he received training from Mitchell on basic counter-surveillance awareness, learning how to observe without being obvious, how to note details about vehicles and individuals without staring, and how to recognize when someone might be watching him. Mitchell provided him with a camera disguised as a thermos, showing him how to photograph envelopes while appearing to take a drink during his route. The training took place in parking lots and public spaces where their meetings would appear coincidental, and Mitchell emphasized repeatedly that James should maintain his normal routine exactly as he always had, that any deviation in his behavior might alert Chen or others who could be monitoring the address. Throughout February and March, letters continued arriving for Robert Chen, and James photographed each one before placing it in the mailbox. The postmarks came from Seattle, Miami, Denver, and Houston, maintaining the pattern of major cities but never repeating the same origin twice in succession. James developed the film at one-hour photo shops in different neighborhoods, paying cash and using different locations each time as Mitchell had instructed, and he delivered the prints to her during brief meetings in public spaces where they appeared to be strangers who happened to be standing near each other. On March 9th, a variation occurred that immediately elevated Mitchell's interest. James rang the doorbell at 2847 Maple Avenue to deliver a certified letter requiring a signature, and a woman he'd never seen before answered the door. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, well-dressed, and she explained in accented English that she was Robert Chen's aunt, visiting from California for a few weeks. James noted the accent, which struck him as vaguely Eastern European rather than Asian, and he mentioned the discrepancy to Mitchell during their next meeting. Mitchell's reaction was immediate and focused. She asked James to describe everything he could remember about the woman, her appearance, her mannerisms, the exact phrasing she'd used when identifying herself. By mid-March, Chen's behavior had begun to shift in subtle ways. He no longer retrieved the mail within 90 seconds of delivery. Sometimes he waited hours, letting the envelopes sit in the mailbox through the afternoon. James wondered if Chen had somehow become aware of surveillance, if there was counter-surveillance he wasn't trained to detect, or if the change in pattern was simply coincidence. Mitchell assured him that behavioral changes were normal, that intelligence networks adjusted constantly to perceived threats, and that the fact Chen was still receiving mail suggested the operation remained active. On April 12th, an envelope arrived that felt different from the others. It was heavier, more rigid, as if it contained something beyond papers or photographs. James photographed it as usual and called Mitchell from a payphone 3 blocks from his route. Mitchell's voice was tight with controlled excitement when she told him that this might be exactly what they'd been waiting for, that the envelope likely contained materials or instructions significant enough to justify moving forward with a warrant. James delivered the envelope at 2:30 in the afternoon, and Chen didn't retrieve it until 6:47 that evening, nearly 4 hours later, emerging from the house only after looking carefully up and down the street as if checking for observers he couldn't quite identify but suspected were there. On April 25, 1978, at 6 o'clock in the morning, FBI agents executed a search warrant on Robert Chen's residence at 2847 Maple Avenue. James Warren was not present during the raid, being a civilian with no operational role beyond his observations, but Special Agent Karen Mitchell called him that afternoon to provide a detailed briefing about what the search had uncovered. Chen had been detained for questioning and was cooperating to a limited degree, answering basic questions but providing minimal information about how the mail operation functioned or who his contacts were. The initial search of the house had revealed exactly what one would expect from a freelance translator working from home. Language dictionaries stacked on shelves, reference materials about technical terminology, file cabinets containing client correspondence, and a modest home office setup with a typewriter and organized paperwork. But the agents had noticed something unusual about the house's dimensions. When they measured the interior rooms and compared those measurements to the exterior footprint of the building, there was a discrepancy of approximately 8 feet in the basement. The floor plan didn't match the actual structure, suggesting that somewhere in the basement there was space that wasn't being accounted for in the visible layout. After an hour of systematic searching, agents found a false wall concealed behind utility shelving that held paint cans, old tools, and cleaning supplies. The shelving unit was mounted on hidden hinges, and when agents moved it aside, they discovered a doorway that had been drywalled over and repainted to blend seamlessly with the surrounding basement walls. Behind the false wall was a workspace, roughly 8 feet by 6 feet, windowless and illuminated by a single overhead bulb. The room contained photography equipment including 2 cameras, developing trays, chemical solutions for processing film, and a microfilm reader sitting on a small desk. There were coding materials spread across the workspace, sheets of paper covered in number sequences and substitution patterns, along with a shortwave radio capable of receiving transmissions from international frequencies. Mitchell told James that the room represented a complete intelligence processing station, the kind of setup that would allow someone to receive coded instructions, photograph documents, develop the images, and transmit information without ever leaving the property. The most significant discovery came from a locked filing cabinet tucked into the corner of the hidden room. Inside were 47 letters, all bearing the same characteristics James had been documenting for months: typed address labels, no return addresses, postmarks from major cities across the United States. The letters dated back at least 3 years, predating James's observations by a significant margin, which meant the operation had been running successfully long before James noticed the pattern. FBI cryptographers examined the letter contents and discovered that what appeared to be ordinary personal correspondence, discussing weather and family matters and mundane daily events, actually contained coded messages embedded through steganography. Specific word patterns and seemingly random details were actually instructions for intelligence operations, lists of potential targets, and operational protocols for field operatives working in the Washington area. Mitchell explained to James that Robert Chen's role in the network was not as a spy himself, but as what intelligence services called an accommodation address manager. He received encoded instructions from Moscow, routed through the United States postal system, processed the information in his basement workspace, and then passed the decoded intelligence to field operatives through dead drops at various locations throughout Northern Virginia. Chen's position in the network meant he was insulated from direct contact with the operatives themselves, creating layers of separation that protected the identities of the actual intelligence officers conducting espionage activities. If Chen was caught, the operatives could continue functioning because Chen had never met them and couldn't identify them to investigators. The FBI traced the letters backward through postal records and postmark analysis, identifying 14 different origin cities where the letters had been mailed over the past 3 years. The pattern suggested multiple Soviet operatives were using Chen as a central communication hub, mailing instructions from whatever city they happened to be operating in at the time. Some of the postmark dates aligned precisely with known travel schedules of Soviet diplomatic personnel who had legitimate reasons to visit various American cities for cultural exchanges or trade discussions. The correlation wasn't proof of direct involvement, but it established a pattern that suggested coordination between the accommodation address operation and Soviet officials operating under diplomatic cover. James was asked to provide a formal deposition about his observation pattern, and his notebook became a key piece of evidence in establishing the timeline of Chen's activities during the period under investigation. A federal prosecutor told James that his attention to detail and willingness to document what he'd noticed had potentially disrupted a major espionage network that had been operating undetected for years. But James found himself feeling conflicted about what he'd done. He had violated an implicit trust that existed between postal carriers and the people they served, had essentially conducted surveillance on a customer's mail, and while the outcome had uncovered genuine criminal activity, the process had required him to abandon principles about privacy that the Postal Service considered fundamental to its mission. Chen was interrogated over multiple sessions spanning several days, and facing the possibility of 30 years or more in federal prison, he agreed to provide limited cooperation with investigators. He confirmed his role as an accommodation address and claimed he had been coerced into the work after visiting relatives in Taiwan in 1973. According to Chen's statement, he had been approached by individuals who threatened harm to family members still living in Asia if he refused to cooperate, and he claimed he had felt he had no choice but to comply with their demands. He provided some details about dead drop locations where he had left decoded messages for pickup, but he insisted he had never met the field operatives who retrieved the information and had been specifically instructed to avoid any direct contact that might compromise the network's security. The FBI found Chen's information frustrating because it was limited by design. He knew procedures but not identities. He understood the system but couldn't name the people operating within it. The letters mentioned specific locations around Northern Virginia where materials were exchanged, park benches, and library book returns, and public telephone booths, but Chen claimed that different couriers picked up the materials each time, and he never saw the same person twice. The network had insulated itself deliberately, ensuring that if one component was compromised, the other parts could continue functioning without interruption. On May 15th, Mitchell called James and told him that surveillance was continuing on the dead drop locations Chen had identified, and that the FBI was watching several sites hoping to identify operatives who might attempt to check whether new materials had been left for pickup. She told James his direct involvement in the investigation was nearly complete, that he'd done what was needed by noticing the pattern and reporting it. James asked if his part was truly over, and Mitchell hesitated before saying not quite, that there was one more thing the FBI needed his help understanding about the mail patterns Chen had been receiving. FBI cryptographers working through the letters recovered from Robert Chen's hidden basement room discovered references in several of the coded messages to what they termed secondary distribution, suggesting that some of the instructions Chen received were meant to be passed along to multiple recipients rather than to a single field operative. The implication troubled the investigators because it suggested the accommodation address network was more extensive than they'd initially understood, that Chen might not be an isolated node, but rather one component of a larger system operating throughout Northern Virginia. Special Agent Karen Mitchell called James Warren and asked him a question that required him to reach back through years of accumulated root knowledge and mental patterns. Had he noticed similar mail characteristics at any other addresses on his route? Letters with no return addresses, typed labels, metered postage from major cities, arriving with suspicious regularity. James sat in his living room that evening with a notepad and began reconstructing his route mentally, address by address, trying to remember details about mail patterns he'd delivered over the past 4 years. It took him nearly 3 hours of concentrated effort, reviewing years of deliveries in his mind, before he recalled another address that had occasionally received letters matching the same characteristics. The address was 3 blocks from Chen's residence, an apartment building at the corner of Cyclair and Commonwealth, specifically Unit 7C. The recipient was Margaret Dietrich, a woman in her early 50s who had once mentioned during a casual conversation that she was a retired librarian living on a modest pension. James remembered that she received letters without return addresses, though far less frequently than Chen, perhaps once every 3 or 4 weeks rather than weekly. But the letters shared the same distinctive features: typed labels, commercial metered postage, major city postmarks. The FBI began surveillance on the Dietrich address in late May, and James resumed his documentation routine, this time photographing mail delivered to both Chen's former residence, where a new tenant had moved in, and to Dietrich's apartment building. Throughout June and July, James confirmed the pattern he'd remembered. Dietrich received a letter approximately every 3 to 4 weeks, always with the characteristics that had originally drawn his attention to Chen's mail. What struck the FBI analysts reviewing James's documentation was that Chen's letters and Dietrich's letters had never arrived during the same week, suggesting a coordinated schedule designed specifically to prevent pattern recognition. If someone happened to notice unusual mail at one address, they were unlikely to connect it to similar mail at another address arriving on a completely different schedule 3 blocks away. The critical confirmation came in mid-July when FBI surveillance teams observed that despite Chen's arrest 6 weeks earlier, Dietrich's letters continued arriving on schedule. This meant the network had either adapted by routing communications through Dietrich exclusively, or that Dietrich had always operated independently as a separate node serving different operatives. Either possibility suggested the Soviet intelligence operation had built redundancy into its communication systems, ensuring that the loss of one accommodation address wouldn't dismantle the entire network. On August 3rd, a particularly thick envelope arrived for Margaret Dietrich, and FBI agents prepared for what they hoped would be an opportunity to observe the next stage of the operation. James delivered the letter at approximately 2 in the afternoon, and surveillance teams watched as Dietrich retrieved it from her mailbox 20 minutes later. Agents followed her as she drove to Tyson's Corner Shopping Center, a large commercial area with multiple department stores and heavy foot traffic that would make surveillance difficult, but would also provide cover for intelligence activities. Dietrich parked near the Sears entrance and sat in her vehicle for 15 minutes, during which time agents watching through telephoto lenses from a position across the parking lot observed her appearing to read something, possibly the contents of the envelope she'd received. Dietrich then walked into the Sears store carrying a shopping bag that hadn't been in her hands when she'd arrived at the parking lot, suggesting she'd transferred something from the envelope into the bag while sitting in her car. She proceeded to the women's clothing section and spent several minutes browsing through racks of dresses and blouses before approaching the fitting rooms. She entered a fitting room carrying the shopping bag and emerged several minutes later without it, having apparently left it inside. 8 minutes after Dietrich left the fitting room area, a different woman, approximately 35 years old with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, entered the same fitting room and emerged 3 minutes later carrying a shopping bag that appeared identical to the one Dietrich had left behind. The FBI now faced a strategic decision that required weighing immediate action against long-term intelligence gathering. They could arrest Dietrich immediately and secure whatever evidence remained of the dead drop operation, Or they could continue surveillance on both Dietrich and the woman who had picked up the shopping bag, hoping to identify additional operatives and map the full extent of the network. The concern with waiting was that if the shopping bag contained decoded intelligence or instructions related to classified information, allowing it to continue moving through the network meant potentially compromising national security. But arresting Dietrich prematurely might scatter other operatives who would recognize that the network had been compromised and would cease operations before the FBI could identify them. The decision was made to continue surveillance and attempt to intercept the next dead drop exchange, giving agents time to prepare a controlled operation where they could observe the full sequence of events and identify everyone involved before making arrests. On August 29th, another letter arrived for Dietrich, and James photographed it during his delivery. FBI surveillance teams positioned themselves at the known dead drop locations Dietrich had used previously, ready to follow her wherever she went. On September 1st, Dietrich drove to Roosevelt Island, a park located in the Potomac River, accessible by footbridge, a location popular with joggers and tourists that would provide natural cover for both intelligence operatives and FBI surveillance. Dietrich walked to a memorial wall near the center of the island and appeared to be reading the inscriptions while actually placing a small envelope behind a loose brick that had been identified in previous surveillance as a potential dead drop location. She remained in the area for approximately 10 minutes, giving the appearance of a casual visitor enjoying the park, before walking back to her car and leaving the island. 43 minutes later, a man agents estimated to be in his mid-30s, athletic build and wearing jogging attire, stopped at the memorial wall, retrieved the envelope from behind the brick, and continued jogging across the footbridge toward the Virginia shoreline where he'd parked a late-model sedan. FBI agents followed the man to an apartment complex in Arlington and identified him as Thomas Kovach, 36 years old, employed as a systems analyst for a defense contracting firm with security clearances that gave him access to classified materials related to satellite reconnaissance and communication systems. The FBI now possessed what they'd been seeking: a documented connection between an accommodation address and an actual intelligence asset with access to sensitive information. The decision was made to continue surveillance on Kovach, observing his movements and activities to determine what he would do with whatever instructions or intelligence he'd received from Dietrich's dead drop. On September 15th, FBI surveillance teams photographed Kovach entering the Soviet Embassy Cultural Affairs Office, a location frequently used for intelligence activities disguised as diplomatic functions. He remained inside for 22 minutes and emerged carrying a shopping bag, a classic brush-pass technique where intelligence materials are exchanged under the cover of ordinary consumer activity. The FBI had seen enough. Coordination began immediately for simultaneous raids on both Dietrich's apartment and Kovach's residence, scheduled for the early morning of September 18th, when both subjects would likely be home, and when surprise would provide maximum advantage for securing evidence before it could be destroyed. The coordinated raids on September 18, 1978, resulted in the arrests of both Margaret Dietrich and Thomas Kovach, and within days, federal prosecutors had filed espionage-related charges against both defendants. Dietrich claimed the same narrative that Robert Chen had offered months earlier, insisting she had been coerced into serving as an accommodation address through threats against family members living in Eastern Europe, that she had been given no choice except to cooperate with demands made by people she claimed not to know and could not identify. Kovach initially refused to cooperate with investigators, invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and providing no statements beyond confirming his identity. Evidence seized during the raids told a more complete story than either defendant was willing to provide. Kovach's apartment contained a camera hidden in a desk drawer, along with undeveloped rolls of film that, once processed, revealed photographs of classified documents related to satellite reconnaissance systems. Dietrich's residence yielded a false-bottom drawer in her bedroom dresser containing coding materials, substitution charts, and handwritten notes about communication protocols that matched the methods used in the letters recovered from Chen's hidden room. By November 1978, as prosecutors prepared for trial, Kovach's resolve began to weaken under the weight of evidence and the prospect of decades in federal prison. After extensive consultation with his attorney and negotiations with federal prosecutors, he agreed to a cooperation deal in exchange for a reduced sentence. The information he provided confirmed what investigators had suspected. He had been receiving operational instructions through the accommodation address network, specifically through materials passed from Dietrich via dead drops at various locations around Northern Virginia. He described his handler as a man in his late 30s who had picked up the envelope at Roosevelt Island, though he claimed to know the handler only by a first name and could provide no information about the man's true identity or where he lived. Kovach admitted he had been recruited in 1976 and had been photographing and passing classified information for approximately 2 years, motivated primarily by money rather than ideology. In December, he was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with credit for cooperation that would ultimately reduce his actual time served to 8 years. Margaret Dietrich's case proceeded differently. In December 1978, she pleaded guilty to acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign government. And during her sentencing hearing, she maintained that she had never known the specific content of the information passing through her accommodation address, that she had simply received letters and followed instructions without understanding what intelligence operations she was facilitating. The federal judge presiding over her case expressed skepticism about this claim, noting in his statement from the bench that willful ignorance could not be accepted as innocence when the defendant had clearly understood she was participating in clandestine activities on behalf of a foreign power. Dietrich was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and would ultimately serve 11 years before being released on parole. The man who had retrieved the envelope from the Roosevelt Island dead drop, the individual Kovach identified as his handler, was never conclusively identified or apprehended. FBI investigators developed a list of persons of interest based on Kovach's physical description and cross-referenced it with the known Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in the Washington area. One individual attached to the Soviet Embassy's Cultural Affairs Office matched the description and had been observed engaging in activities consistent with intelligence work, but he possessed diplomatic immunity that prevented arrest or prosecution. In September 1979, approximately 1 year after the Dietrich and Kovach arrests, the suspected handler returned to the Soviet Union as part of a routine diplomatic rotation, placing him permanently beyond the reach of American law enforcement. James Warren continued working his postal route throughout 1979 and 1980, but the experience of the investigation had fundamentally altered his relationship with the work. He found himself scrutinizing every piece of mail he delivered, looking for patterns and anomalies that might indicate intelligence activities. His wife, Linda, noticed the change in him, commenting one evening that he no longer seemed to be simply delivering mail, but rather investigating it, treating every envelope as potential evidence of something hidden. James received a commendation from the Postmaster General in early 1979 for exceptional service to the nation, a formal recognition of his role in disrupting the accommodation address network. But the award felt hollow to him because it required acknowledging that he had violated principles he'd once considered fundamental to his profession. The ethical weight of what he'd done troubled him throughout this period. The Postal Service operated on an implicit contract with the American public that mail would be delivered without interference or surveillance, that carriers would respect the privacy of correspondence even when that correspondence might contain information the carrier found suspicious or troubling. James had broken that contract, had essentially spied on customers whose mail he was entrusted to deliver, and while the outcome had been the disruption of genuine espionage operations, the process had required him to abandon principles about privacy and trust that he'd believed were essential to democratic society. He had long conversations with Linda about the balance between security and liberty, about whether the ends justified the means, and he found no easy answers to the questions that kept him awake at night. In late 1980, James noticed a new pattern developing on his route. A different address, this time a townhouse on Bradford Street, was receiving letters with characteristics similar to those that had drawn his attention to Chen and Dietrich. The recipient was a middle-aged woman who claimed to be a freelance editor working from home, and the letters arrived with typed labels, no return addresses, and metered postage from major cities. James sat in his postal truck after delivering one of these letters, staring at the envelope he'd just photographed using the FBI camera he still carried, and he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling over him again. He debated whether to report the pattern immediately or to watch for several more weeks to establish certainty, knowing that premature reporting might alert the recipient if the FBI investigation became too obvious too quickly. On a cold morning in December 1980, James sat in his truck holding another suspicious letter and reached for the phone to call Special Agent Mitchell. He hesitated with his hand on the receiver, asking himself whether this vigilance was truly his responsibility or whether he'd transformed himself into something he'd never intended to become. A postal carrier who could no longer simply deliver mail without suspecting everyone of potential espionage. The question hung in the air for several seconds before he completed the call. Mitchell answered on the second ring, and when James described what he'd been observing, she sighed quietly before asking if the pattern matched what he'd seen before. James confirmed that it did, exactly the same characteristics, and Mitchell told him she would initiate a preliminary investigation. James hung up the phone and continued his route, carrying not just mail, but the weight of watching, the burden of patterns only he seemed able to see. The investigation James initiated in December 1980 proceeded through January and into early spring of 1981, following the same methodical pattern that had worked with Chen and Dietrich. FBI surveillance confirmed that the recipient at the Bradford Street address, a woman named Helen Westbrook who was 47 years old and claimed to work as a freelance manuscript editor, was indeed operating as another accommodation address within the Soviet intelligence network. In March 1981, Westbrook was arrested, along with two individuals identified as field operatives who had been receiving decoded instructions through dead drops she maintained at various locations throughout Falls Church and Arlington. James's testimony during the subsequent legal proceedings once again proved crucial in establishing the timeline and pattern evidence that prosecutors used to demonstrate systematic espionage activity rather than isolated incidents. The success of the Westbrook investigation prompted the FBI to conduct a comprehensive review of postal delivery patterns across Northern Virginia, interviewing mail carriers in areas surrounding Langley and other sensitive government installations to determine whether accommodation address operations were more widespread than the 3 cases James had uncovered. The review discovered at least 12 other addresses that had been receiving similar suspicious mail between 1974 and 1981, suggesting that Soviet intelligence had constructed redundant and overlapping networks designed to ensure that even if several accommodation addresses were compromised, others would continue functioning. James's observations, while significant, represented only a small fraction of a much larger communication system that had been operating successfully for nearly a decade. Between 1981 and 1983, the FBI contracted James as a consultant, while he maintained his regular postal route. He trained other mail carriers in pattern recognition techniques, helping them understand what characteristics might indicate intelligence activities without encouraging them to violate postal privacy protocols unnecessarily. He developed guidelines that attempted to balance vigilance with respect for civil liberties, outlining what should be reported and what remained within the bounds of normal mail variation. James became a subject matter expert on accommodation address operations and testified in 4 additional espionage cases through 1983. His credibility as an observant professional who had noticed genuine patterns lending weight to prosecutions that might otherwise have struggled to convince juries that seemingly innocent mail deliveries constituted evidence of espionage. But the specialized knowledge and constant vigilance exacted a personal toll that became increasingly difficult to manage. James's marriage suffered under the strain of work he couldn't fully discuss with his wife, cases that required his testimony but remained partially classified, and a growing sense of isolation from colleagues who didn't understand why he'd become so invested in what they considered activities beyond a mail carrier's proper responsibilities. Linda told him in 1984 that he was carrying more than mail, that the weight of what he'd discovered and reported had changed him in ways that worried her, that he seemed unable to turn off the investigative mindset even during off hours. James began therapy later that year for stress and hypervigilance, working with a counselor to address the paranoia that had developed from years of watching for patterns and suspicious behaviors in every aspect of his daily route. By the mid-1980s, Soviet intelligence operations had begun adapting to the exposure of accommodation address networks. The methods James had become expert at recognizing appeared less frequently as foreign intelligence services shifted toward electronic communications, fax machines, and early computer bulletin board systems that offered different opportunities for covert messaging. James's specialized knowledge became less relevant to current operations, and the FBI consulting contract ended in 1985 with expressions of gratitude for his service, but acknowledgement that the techniques he'd helped expose were no longer the primary concern for counterintelligence efforts. From 1985 through 1990, James attempted to return to being simply a mail carrier, delivering letters and packages without scrutinizing every envelope for hidden meanings. The effort proved difficult, because the pattern recognition mindset he'd developed over 8 years of investigation couldn't be easily disabled. He still occasionally noticed mail that seemed suspicious and reported it to FBI contacts, though most of these observations turned out to be innocent correspondence that happened to match characteristics he'd learned to watch for. He realized gradually that the heightened awareness had become permanent, that he would never again be able to deliver mail with the uncomplicated professionalism he'd once taken pride in. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought an end to the Cold War and prompted declassification of some counterintelligence operations, including cases James had participated in. News articles about accommodation address networks identified James by name as the postal carrier, who had noticed suspicious patterns and reported them to authorities, resulting in the disruption of Soviet espionage activities in Northern Virginia. A local newspaper ran a feature story with the headline, "Mailman Who Spotted Soviet Spies," and James found himself briefly thrust into public attention he hadn't sought and didn't particularly want. He told reporters who called that he had simply delivered mail and noticed things that seemed unusual, that he'd done what he thought was right, and that he didn't consider himself a hero, but rather someone who'd been observant enough to see patterns that others had missed. In 1995, after 26 years with the Postal Service, James retired at a ceremony attended by colleagues, family, and a representative from the FBI who presented him with a formal commendation, recognizing his contributions to national security. The speech delivered at his retirement emphasized that vigilance in ordinary duties could produce extraordinary consequences, that attention to detail in even the most routine work could matter in ways that weren't immediately apparent. James listened to these words and thought about the cost of that vigilance, about the years spent watching and documenting and testifying, about the weight of suspicion that had become impossible to set down even after the threats had diminished. His children asked him later about the years he'd spent identifying Soviet spies, curious about their father's role in events they'd only dimly understood while growing up. James struggled to explain the mixture of duty, curiosity, patriotism, and perhaps obsession that had driven him to document mail patterns for years and to involve himself in investigations that extended far beyond his responsibilities as a postal carrier. He told them he believed he'd been right to report what he'd noticed, that the espionage networks he'd helped disrupt had been real and had posed genuine threats. But he was less certain about whether he'd been right to let the work consume him as completely as it had, to allow the watching and the suspicion to become permanent features of how he moved through the world. On his final day of work, James delivered his last route, passing by addresses where Chen and Dietrich and Westbrook had once lived, all now occupied by different residents who had no knowledge of the history attached to those locations. He placed the final letter in the final mailbox and walked back to his postal truck, looking at the quiet street that appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary Northern Virginia neighborhood. But James knew better than to trust appearances, knew that nothing was ever simply what it seemed to be, and he drove away carrying the weight of patterns that only he could see, the burden of vigilance that would follow him into retirement and beyond.